Great. So I'll go ahead and just open us up here. To those of you joining, thank you. Thanks for those of you who stuck with us through the little bit of the technical difficulties. I know it seems like we had the link go bad, but we fixed that, and looks like now we're up to 19 attendees and growing by the minute. So thanks for sticking with us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Lynn. I'm currently the interim president of the ALDF. That's a little bit of a self-appointed role because we just got started as an organization a couple of months ago and have really hit the ground running. So formerly the ALDF at GSU had gone dormant for a couple of semesters, but when I and some other students started with the help of Professor Boyd, we got everything off the ground again. So thank you to Professor Boyd and those other introductory members that we had. And when we started as an organization, we had 3 goals. Those goals were to become an officially recognized organization by the ALDF GSU. We did that. The next goal was to get some t-shirts for the organization, which we did. Here are the t-shirts, and they got some sort of provocative statements on the back. That's pretty cool. We actually got those t-shirts paid for by a grant with the ALDF. And a grant from Professor Boyd to cover the sales tax on it. So that was great. And then our third goal was to host a discussion with some members of the animal law community. And that's what we're doing today with Ms. Rock and Ms. Nasser. So thank you both for being here. If you're a student looking to join an organization, I encourage you to join us at the ALDF and be part of all the great stuff that's happening. Free t-shirts, great opportunities, network opportunities, and all that. And another note on that, we do not make people pay dues. So no barriers to entry. Please come join us, and we're growing by the day. So Evan, I'll kick it over to you if you want to make any announcements for the Criminal Law Society.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Evan Hansinger. I am a 3L here at Georgia State, going into my last year, one more semester after this one. Then I'll be graduating. So the Criminal Law Society, we try to kind of stay active and have a lot of events and cover a lot of different topics. So when Ryan reached out for this opportunity, it was definitely something that we jumped at. It was something we had actually thought about prior to Ryan reaching out as just kind of an interesting topic, especially, with having the Tiger King documentary come out during the beginning of kind of the quarantine. It's definitely something that was on our radar, and we love kind of working with other student orgs to have these thought-provoking and interesting conversations. So we're really excited for this. We're always looking for these kind of cool opportunities to do that.
Yeah, great. And I really appreciate Evan, who has been instrumental in helping us kind of legitimize getting everything set up with the university and everything in this event. So thanks, Evan, and all the people at the Criminal Law Society for doing this nice joint event. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ms. Rock. Ms. Rock's going to speak for about 10 or so minutes about a topic with her work that, tells about the cross-section of animal and criminal law. And then after that, I'll do a little introduction of Ms. Nasser, and then Ms. Nasser will also do the same. And then after that, we'll open up for panel questions, and we'll, with audience questions, if we have time at the end, we will try to get to audience questions. If any of you in the audience have questions that come up, please put them in the chat. If it makes sense to ask, we'll try to weave that in to the discussion, or we may save those questions to the end. We'll see. But if you've got something that I think is a question that goes along with what's being addressed, please encourage you to put that in there. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ms. Rock and let her take it away. So Jesica Rock is a graduate of the University of Florida, go Gators, where she got her bachelor's degree in criminology. After that, she moved here to Atlanta and attended Emory University, where she earned her JD. Jesica Rock's experience is pretty extensive, but some of the highlights of that include that, she's worked on prosecution for most of her career. She has run, and I believe still runs, her own private practice. She is an adjunct professor at the University of Florida within their College of Veterinary Medicine, and I think we're going to get to hear a little bit about that today. Some really interesting things that she does at UF. She's also a professional speaker at the Justice Clearinghouse, so that's great for us. We have a professional speaker speaking to us today. And Jessica's newest endeavor, among the many things that she also simultaneously does, is that she's a special U.S. assistant attorney focused on animal crimes. And to my knowledge, I believe, Jessica, you're only the second person that's ever held that type of role. Is that correct?
It's the first in Georgia and one of the handful across the nation. There are some other ones in the United States, but it's very rare.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique role. So, well, I guess we're going to get to hear a little bit about that throughout this hour. So I'll go ahead and let you take the floor and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I just want to say hello to everyone who's joined us today. I am just super excited anytime law students want to get involved in anything animal law related, because as you can imagine, back in the early 2000s when I was in law school, we didn't really talk about these issues a whole lot. So thank you guys so much, Evan, Ryan, Professor Boyd, and Ms. Nasser for all putting this on, and thanks for everyone who joined us. I'm going to talk to you just briefly. Can y'all share? Let me share this, or I guess I got to share my screen down here. Hold on. Okay. I'm giving you basically the, Cliff Notes version of what I typically cover in multiple hours. But just to briefly talk about my background a little bit and how I got here, I've just been really lucky. Honestly, I've been really lucky that I've known the right people who've put me in the right positions to be able to do this job full time most of my career. Back in 2004, I was the first animal cruelty prosecutor specializing in animal cruelty prosecutions and investigations with law enforcement. And in 2019, many years later, I became Georgia's first statewide animal crimes prosecutor. So my role is to assist other agencies, law enforcement, and prosecutors with investigations and prosecutions of animal cruelty and animal fighting cases. And then I also have my own caseload. And then, as Ryan just mentioned, in 2020, I was, again, just really lucky enough to be put in this position as a federal prosecutor now handling animal crime. So I'm very grateful for all the people that have allowed me to do this job and to continue to do it. I want to talk to you a little bit today about why I do what I do. Over 50% of all law enforcement calls are domestic violence related. And we know that pet abuse is one of the 4 most significant risk factors of somebody later becoming a domestic violence abuser. So that tells you if we are able to stop criminal activity and stop abusers from harming humans, we need to start looking at the pets as well. If we find out that pets are being harmed or neglected in a home, then we really need to start looking at the humans as well. And it all kind of ties together. Unfortunately, you can imagine anybody who's going to treat an animal or a human that is more vulnerable than them, they're probably going to be doing it to more than one person in that household. When we talk about link cases, what are cases that we need to pay attention to when it comes to animal abuse? We know that animal abuse is so closely connected to our domestic violence cases, our child abuse cases, our elder abuse cases, and neglect cases. And then obviously when we talk about animal abuse, it not only includes animal neglect, animal abuse, but also animal sexual assault, animal fighting, animal hoarding, and puppy mills. We know that animal abuse is what we consider a predictor crime. Just like I spoke about a minute ago, we know it's a red flag or a warning sign that other members in the household might not be safe. Animal abusers are about 5 times as likely to harm humans. So again, if we start investigating the animal abuse crimes and we start looking at the animals in the home and asking questions about animals in the home, we might prevent not only abuse of that animal, but future abuse of that human as well. When we talk about link cases, again, it's cases that involve multiple victims in a household. We've also uncovered that this extends to our animal fighting cases. We've seen offenses such as homicide, weapons, drug offenses, even gang violence associated with our dog fighting and our cockfighting cases. We see with animal sexual assault and bestiality that connected to child abuse and child pornography. And we even see incidents of terrorism that are connected to animal abuse. I'm not going to throw a whole lot of statistics at you because that gets really boring, but these are just some you really can't get past. We know that about 85%, listen folks, 85% of domestic violence victims entering shelters that own pets are reporting some type of harm or threat of harm by their partners to their pets. About 63% of children entering shelters are discussing the same type of abuse. That is scary. We know about 65% of battered women report that they didn't leave their abusive situation because they were concerned for the safety of their pet. We know that intimate partner victims whose partners have a history of pet abuse, when we look at the data with those types of cases, we know that 26% of those victims have been forced to have sex with the suspect. 80% have at least one reported undocumented DV incident. Usually it's much more than that. 76% of them are reporting being strangled, and 80% of those intimate partner victims that have a history of pet abuse by their abuser are fearing that they would be killed by the suspect. So not only do we know that there's a significant connection between domestic violence and animal abuse cases, we know that when somebody is abusing an animal, they are much more likely to be extremely violent, doing these types of things that lead oftentimes, unfortunately, to homicide. We know that abusers use certain types of power and control when it comes to animals. They use animals to exert power and control over their victims. These are just a couple ways that they do it. They will oftentimes threaten to kill or abuse a pet during the relationship, or if the pet is left behind, causing that victim not to want to escape their domestic violence situation. We see abusers threaten to go to the court and claim that the victim stole their pet if they leave without the pet. We've also seen pets get involved in custody battles in the same form or fashion. We see intimidation. So an abuser harming or threatening to kill a pet and then saying next time it will be you. And just quickly, I had a very horrible case when I first started prosecuting these crimes early on in my career, where an 8-year-old boy who had gotten close to his puppy, his dad took him and his puppy out back and punted the puppy like a football in the chest, and basically told his son that if he talked about the abuse that was going on in the home, that was going to be him. And that puppy ended up dying in front of the 8-year-old child. So those are the types of real life cases that I see, unfortunately. This is just a snippet from a victim in one of these situations. She stated that he said, if I left, it would be a death sentence for my beagle. My kids loved that dog so much. I knew he would kill it if I left. So I stayed for 5 more years. Unfortunately, this is typical in these types of situations. I'm going to play a quick video for you, and I know you can't hear it, but this is a very powerful video just to tell you in a couple seconds what I'm talking about. I know y'all can't hear the video, but I think you can get the point by just watching it. Very powerful PSA out of the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office. This is also a video from a case. I know you can't hear this either, but this is a video of a domestic violence abuser that took his girlfriend's cat and duct taped it and then started videotaping it and rolling it around. Then he went and videotaped her crying about it, and he chases her throughout the house and mocks her. I know you can't hear on the video, but he's mocking her right now about the cat. He's just making fun of her walking around the house. And then at the end, he hits her. We don't get that kind of evidence on video very often, but as you can see, this is some of the horrors of what domestic violence victims deal with when it comes to threatening or harming their pet. Just quickly, when we talk about abuse in children, we know about 76% of incidents of animal abuse are occurring in front of children. Imagine what that does to our children. About 32% of children in those households, those abusive households, then turn around and abuse the pets themselves. I could talk for hours and hours about this, but as you can imagine, that does some pretty horrible things to our children, including very much a desensitization to violence. Children often feel guilty about not being able to protect their pets in these situations. We see abusers exploit their bond with the pet in many different ways, like threatening to harm the pet in order to silence the child about disclosing abuse, like I mentioned earlier. They will harm a pet to punish the child, send a message to the child, and sometimes even force a child to actually participate in the abuse themselves. Animal abuse in the elderly, we see a connection here too. Oftentimes caregivers are using some type of harm or threat of harm in order to control or retaliate against the people they're taking care of. And unfortunately, we see a lot of times our adult protective case service workers who are monitoring these elderly persons aren't even asking about pets. So one of the biggest things I always talk about to anybody who's involved in either DFACS, adult protective services, any of these types of organizations that work with children, domestic violence advocates, elder abuse advocates, is always ask questions about pets because it may unveil a lot more than you would think. Animal hoarding is another one we see, unfortunately. Lots of issues going on in homes where hoarding of animals is taking place, child neglect, elder neglect, if those persons are in the homes as well. Puppy mills is another one. Could spend hours and hours and hours talking about the horrors of puppy mills and how many other different types of crimes are connected to people who breed and sell animals purely for profit. Bestiality, something people don't like to talk about. It happens a lot though. We know that childhood sexual assault is linked to animal sexual assault. Abusers often use animals as a grooming tool to move on to the children. We know bestiality, which is animal sexual abuse, is the single largest risk factor and strongest predictor for somebody committing child sexual abuse. So again, we've always got to be asking questions about pets. Dog fighting is another one. Again, could spend hours on this, but these are the types of issues we see when it comes to just the abuse in the process of training an animal to fight in and of itself. We see all of these different types of crimes: gambling, drugs, gangs, battery and violence, illegal weapons, child neglect, endangerment, homicide, unlicensed practice of veterinary medicine, animal cruelty, all connected to animal fighting cases. We know there's a link between owning vicious dogs. And again, I'm not saying that pit bulls are vicious dogs. Please don't take that. But if you're raising a dog for the purpose of dog fighting and you're owning a dog that you're making vicious, we see those persons often linked to domestic violence, narcotic offenses, child abuse, and substance abuse issues as well. Cockfighting, same thing. We see gambling, obviously connected to this, firearms and weapons offenses, gangs, cartel members, the violence that surrounds them. And imagine what this does to our children. You can see the right-hand side there. These children have a trophy from a cockfighting event. These children are growing up watching these blood sports, thinking that this is normal behavior. These are just some pictures from people who are raising chickens to fight. This was an animal abuse investigation of a number of persons who had been arrested for animal cruelty or animal fighting. And you can just see the amount of other types of crimes that they have in their background, some of which are very violent. So we know that people who are violent to animals often turn around and are later violent to humans. This is just something I want to end with. We know that people are at risk when animals are abused, and animals are at risk when people are abused. Taking animal abuse seriously will lead to justice for animals and certainly the identification of other crimes involving humans.
Wow, thank you, Ms. Rock, and that is truly some disturbing but images, but that need to be seen and understood, especially by us as law students and future members of the legal community. So thank you for that. I know I personally have a ton of questions off of that, but I think we're going to move to Ms. Nasser because a lot of the questions I think that I and other people probably have are ones that both of you can answer through your respective fields. So thank you. And all right, so now introducing Miss Carney Anne Nasser. So Miss Nasser is a graduate of UC San Diego, where she majored in political science, philosophy, and feminist theory. She also got a graduate certificate from GW in community advocacy, and she earned her JD from Tulane down in New Orleans, one of my favorite places. She's worked in a few different fields of the law, including sports law, where she worked for the Oakland Raiders and Tulane University Athletic. She's been a city attorney for the city of Dallas, and she's also worked as counsel for both PETA and the ALDF. She's one of the country's only full-time was one of the country's only full-time animal law professors and program directors at Michigan State University College of Law. And most recently, she's provided guidance to political candidates, elected officials, corporations, and other organizations about strategies and policies and marketing tactics regarding mostly animal welfare. And she does this through independent consulting and her organization called Claws Consulting. So Ms. Nasser is also a Porsche autocross driver, so maybe we'll get to hear a little bit about that. The New York Times calls her the nation's go-to person for laws pertaining to big cat ownership. So with all that said, Ms. Nasser, hopefully I got all of that right. If not, feel free to correct me, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, I'm gonna rejigger my the order of what I'm gonna present, because I feel like we could all start out with some good news right now, right? I think I mean, it's so sobering anytime you talk about the link, and certainly the issues that I have my expertise in pertain to the cub petting industry, the tiger cub world of wildlife trafficking for profit, for entertainment, and the cub petting that you may have seen glimpses of if you watched the train wreck dumpster fire reality show known as Tiger King. But that's what I focused on for the last 10 years. And the good news is that every single roadside zoo owner who we saw featured in Tiger King is now either in prison under indictment or has been shut down by federal agency enforcement action, which is very rare and only happens in the most egregious situations. So that's the good news. So things are changing for big cats who are kept in captivity and deprived of everything that's natural and important to them. So by starting at the end, now I'm going to take you back to the beginning, which is what the current legal framework is, what the problem is, and what we need to do to change it. And I'm going to use Joe Exotic's prosecution, since I pitched that wildlife trafficking case to federal prosecutors both in Louisiana and in Oklahoma. I'm going to use that sort of as a little case study to explain some of these laws that are in some cases being under enforced or not enforced as much as they should be, which is creating a perfect storm for the abuse and trafficking of tigers and other big cats right here in the United States. So the first thing that you should know about the cub petting industry is that roadside zoo owners, circuses, anybody who is breeding and trading in big cats are using what we call generic tigers. Generic tigers are crossbred or inbred. All white tigers are inbred. They have no conservation value. So the notion that the roadside zoo owners love to perpetuate to their unknowing customers is that it's good to keep breeding these animals. I mean, we saw it with Tim Stark in Tiger King, and he said, well, they're endangered. You should just breed more. That's just, it logically follows. Well, what he didn't tell people is that the roadside zoo owners only breed tigers who don't exist in the wild. So these cats have no conservation value. You can ask U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, or anybody who's in a legitimate conservation capacity. These generic or intersub-specific, meaning tiger mutts or crossbred tigers, have no conservation value. Why are they breeding tigers with no conservation value? Why are they purposefully going out of their way to create tiger mutts? It's because of a loophole in the Endangered Species Act that existed between 1998 and 2016, which we in the field colloquially call the generic tiger loophole. And what this did is it lifted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's eyes. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the federal agency that administers the Endangered Species Act and its associated regulations. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service took its eyes off of monitoring the breeding and trade in generic tigers. It said, you know what, we're just going to focus on the purebred tigers. The only purebred tigers in America are the 250 or so who are in Association of Zoos and Aquariums managed breeding programs. So those are your AZA zoos, like the Audubon Zoo here in New Orleans, like the San Diego Zoo, the Dallas Zoo. All of these facilities are accredited by the AZA and have very specific standards for conservation breeding programs. They're not breeding to release these cats back into the wild, but they are adhering to a very strict breeding protocols to create pure genetic lineage of certain subspecies. So the roadside zoos are lying in their marketing, surprise, surprise, by telling people that they have some function with conservation, which they don't. The other issue here is that what happens, these cats, and you may have seen this in Tiger King as well, is just a quick frame where a neonatal cub was torn through a cyclone fence. These cats are forcibly removed from their mothers upon birth or shortly thereafter. The roadside zoos love to say that the mother rejected the cub, but what's happening in reality is that the facilities rip these cubs away from their mothers to habituate them to human contact so that they can be passed around for up to 60 sessions a day. These sessions generate anywhere between $50 to over $2,000 per session. So you can see what a moneymaker a cub is. And it's only legal under the Federal Animal Welfare Act regulations for these cub experiences to be offered, for there to be direct contact between a member of the public and one of the big cats when they're approximately 8 to 12 weeks of age. So that's a very narrow window. So these facilities, first of all, they try to push both ends. They try to offer them for contact early, and then they underfeed them so they stay small and they can pass them off as younger than they are for longer to push beyond that 12-week window. I sent an undercover investigator into a facility in California at one point and had photos taken of him with a lion cub who's 6 months old. So clear violations. The facility got slapped with some violations from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and for that. But that's typical. I mean, that is the rule, not the exception, when it comes to facilities that are exploiting big cats for entertainment. What happens to these cats once they're past the point where they can be offered for public contact, like reasonably, without it being completely dangerous? There's a revolving door, and many times because of the defects in the law and the patchwork of state laws, there's no consistency in laws overseeing the transfer, trade, or even housing of these big cats. They fall into a black hole, literally. And we don't have a legal mechanism to track where these critically endangered animals are coming or going. So that's part of the reason that we have no way of knowing exactly how many tigers there are in the United States. The numbers are so speculative. They range from anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 big cats. And it's one of the reasons that when we go, for the last two CITES treaty meetings, the CITES treaty is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. It's the most significant multilateral wildlife treaty in the world. And it pertains to the trade in endangered species of animals and plants. Big cats are always, at the forefront, along with a number of other species like pangolins and elephants. But, we have a problem with China and their breeding of cats, their farming of tigers for traditional Chinese medicine and for trinkets and other items that are coveted by the wealthy classes. And they're really acting in defiance of the CITES treaty, which they have been a signatory to for decades. But we don't have the credibility to really hold their feet to the fire because we can't even figure out how many big cats we have. And that's what they tell us whenever we have conversations with China and other countries that are engaged in tiger farming for parts and the parts trade and the black market trade. Their response is, well, at least we know how many tigers we have and where they are. So our lack of ability and our lack of will here in the United States to really crack down on the treatment, trade, and exploitation of animals on the endangered species list is minimalizing our credibility on the international stage in a lot of other issues. So So that's just a little bit about the cub petting. With Joe Exotic, what happened there is he had been getting tigers from all over the country. I mean, he was buying animals and selling them. He was creating ligers and tigons and these, what I call Franken cats, and selling them for, I saw one liger cub go for $6,800 to a woman in Texas who ultimately wasn't able to keep it. Surprise, surprise. Like, apex predators don't make good pets. And the cat got dumped in another facility, and only because of social media I was able to track down where this cat went and what happened and how much she had paid for the cat. But that's just one cat. So this is something that has been going on for years and years and years, and Joe Exotic has really been at the epicenter. He and Doc Antle, who is also just recently indicted for wildlife trafficking and other animal crimes. The two of them have been operating as really the go-to tiger traffickers in the United States and source for many of the tigers that you see in roadside zoos across the United States. So I had noticed that Joe had made a sloppy work with some paperwork and a transfer of cats from a failing facility that's now defunct up in Shreveport, Louisiana, or the Shreveport area. And I put together a case. I've got the paperwork through FOIA requests. The Freedom of Information Act is probably an animal lawyer's best friend. I spend a lot of time doing FOIA requests, doing FOIA appeals, and FOIA litigation. But getting sufficient records to put together a demonstration of a Lacey Act violation by both the seller and Joe. And those cats were then transferred across state lines back into Oklahoma. Because I happen to have some connections with the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Louisiana, I went and I took the binder that I put together. I pitched the case for a wildlife trafficking case against Joe. The Lacey Act is the federal wildlife trafficking law. There are three primary laws that govern big cats in the United States, and it's the Lacey Act, which deals with trafficking, the Endangered Species Act, which governs how endangered species are transferred, permitted for import, export, and also how they are now. We have new federal court precedent pertaining to how they're treated in captivity and the types of conditions that they're forced to live in could trigger a violation of the Endangered Species Act and the Federal Animal Welfare Act. And roadside zoos love to say that, we're federally licensed and inspected. Well, the Animal Welfare Act application is $30. It's the federal agency inspects for bare minimum standards. We're talking about standards that are so low that are virtually, does the animal have enough space to stand up, turn around, lie down? Is there water? Is there food? They're not species specific regulations. And moreover, the agency's own internal auditing department has repeatedly criticized the USDA for failing to do its job. So we find animals who are sick, dying, injured, getting no veterinary care, and the facility is not even getting cited by the USDA, let alone shut down. That's just par for the course. So whenever a facility says we're federally licensed and inspected, like it's absurd. It's sort of the bare minimum entry point to operate a roadside zoo legally. So those are the three main federal laws. I was pitching a case based on violations of the Lacey Act. As I had hoped, the investigators and prosecutors in Lafayette, Louisiana, said, we really want to prosecute this case. And however, it looks like there's more activity on the Oklahoma side. So we're going to make a collateral request to our colleagues in Oklahoma City. So I flew up to Oklahoma City and met with some really phenomenal U.S. attorneys or assistant U.S. attorneys up there and special agents with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they opened an investigation and found not only chronic wildlife trafficking, which is what the judge said at Joe's sentencing hearing in January, but also criminal violations of the Endangered Species Act. And then in the middle of this investigation, right before Joe is going to get indicted for wildlife crimes, the whole issue with murder for hire blew up. So he was first indicted for that. And I think that's something that a lot of people probably don't realize. The wildlife trafficking prosecution was already in the hopper, so to speak. That was going to happen anyway. The murder for hire came up in the middle of that. And so it would have, he would be, I firmly believe, based on the evidence that there was and based on the phenomenal team that was investigating and prosecuting that case, that Joe would be in prison right now, regardless of the the murder for hire. But it just happened to coincide at the same time. So that's a little bit behind the scenes of the situation with Joe. We do have a lot of new federal court precedent, like I mentioned before, interpreting the Endangered Species Act in such a way that courts are saying, the provision of the ESA that prohibits harming and harassing an endangered species is going to be interpreted to prevent declawing tiger cubs, which their roadside zoos frequently use pliers and hammers to perform partial amputation of these cubs so that they're less likely to injure one of the paying guests. They force them to live frequently in their own waste in situations that are totally unsafe. And these are now being interpreted by federal courts in Florida, Indiana, and in Iowa as criminal violations of the Endangered Species Act. So that's a really, really promising development. And I should say, let me correct myself there, civil violations. The precedent that's being set all over the country right now is in citizen suits that are being brought by advocacy organizations like the Animal Legal Defense Fund and the PETA Foundation, along with concerned citizens, local concerned citizens. The ESA has a citizen suit provision that enables them to directly sue the roadside zoo for alleged violations of the Endangered Species Act. Unfortunately, the Animal Welfare Act doesn't have that, so we can't go after all the animals in a roadside zoo if they're being abused and subjected to cruel treatment. But the ESA now has a broader application, which is tremendously helpful. And that's one of the ways that we've been able to shut down so many of these roadside zoos. So the dominoes are falling. It is, I do believe that it's only a matter of when, not if, we are going to put these bad actors out of business. But we do need the U.S. government to actually take this more seriously, because wildlife trafficking is linked to a number of other organized crimes and a lot of other criminal activity. I mean, just like Jessica was saying, you rarely find animal abuse without other types of violent crime or other types of serious criminal activity. And the same thing goes for wildlife trafficking and abuse of big animals like apex predators. So right now, the Big Cat Public Safety Act is pending in Congress. And what that would do it would establish the much needed uniformity of law that we are lacking, that we desperately need in the United States. No states have the same laws on exotic animal ownership. There are 4 states that don't even have any law prohibiting big cat ownership by private citizens. So it would prohibit big cats as pets, and it would also prohibit public contact in facilities. And it's really the public contact, because it's such a moneymaker, that's driving this illicit breeding and what I call the breed and dump cycle. So that, in conjunction with the litigation that's happening, the impact litigation that's happening, gives me a lot of hope for at least putting a meaningful dent in the chronic abuse and trafficking of big cats in the United States.
Wow, thank you so much, Ms. Nasser. And yeah, that's pretty enlightening. There's a lot of interesting things to unpack in there. It's especially interesting that organizations like Concerned Citizens and the ALDF and PETA can bring those civil suits against these roadside zoos, which, I mean, that's a great development, something that, like you kind of touched on, we hope would go beyond just the endangered species. So that can be applied to, dogfighting cases and things like that as well. But thank you. And I think we're going to go ahead and roll down into some panel questions and hopefully address a lot of the things that both of you touched on in that first 10 or 15 minutes that you took. So I'm going to just start with our first panel question. So taking a step back from a lot of what we just talked about, most of us here on this call are law students. There are, I think, some members of the legal community also joining us. Thank you to those of you who have joined us. But as law students, we should hear from as many people as possible who have become wildly successful in the law and the journey that took them there. So we'll start with you, Ms. Rock. If you can explain what drove you to law school, how you started your career at a law school, and maybe a little bit of a progression of how your career developed from that point to where you are now.
Well, oddly enough, I went to law school to be a criminal defense lawyer, and people kind of laugh when they know what I do now because I'm very much the opposite of that. But went to law school and, always knew I was interested in criminal law. Got out of law school, clerked for a judge, which law students, probably the best thing you can do if you can get a clerkship out of law school. You learn a lot of great things about the do's and don'ts of courtroom. Ins and outs. So anyways, clerked for a judge and essentially kind of got every job I got from there, from clerking for a judge. I ended up working for a Supreme Court justice in Georgia during an internship. And then once I graduated from law school, the judge that I was clerking for at the time, or right out of law school, said, you really need to go be a prosecutor no matter what you do. And so she gave me my first job. And so, you listen to a judge who gave you your first job. And I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And, oddly enough, 17 years later, I'm still doing it. And I love it. And, I can't say enough good things about being on this side of the law and being able to hold offenders accountable for the harm that they perpetrate on animals. And not only that, the humans that I see so often connected to these cases as well. And I just, like I said, there's not a whole lot of people around the country who get to dedicate their careers to doing nothing but animal law. And I'm just very fortunate to be in that position. And I'm always happy to help any law students who are interested. I'm always happy to go out to lunch with you and sit down and talk about ways that you can also get involved and ways that you can maybe make a career out of this too.
Thank you, Ms. Rock. Ms. Nasser, same question for you.
Well, I went to law school for sports law, and I, which also, much like animal law, there's no such thing as sports law, and there's no such thing as animal law. It's a multidisciplinary practice, which I love because I like being able to toggle between a lot of different things. And I love, especially with animal law, the creativity that's not only encouraged, but absolutely necessary for us to advance the legal interests of beings who don't actually have rights. However, what I love to tell people in my story, and I've told my law students this many times, I always tell my students this, is that I graduated in the middle to bottom of my class. I don't have federal clerkship experience. I wasn't the Order of the Coif. I wasn't editor of the Law Review. I was just a person who, once I figured out what I wanted to do, had an overwhelming amount of grit and determination. And and I found myself competing in the nonprofit world, the animal protection world. Has gotten increasingly more competitive. There are so many more people who want to practice and do impact litigation for the advocacy organizations like PETA, ALDF, Mercy for Animals, Farm Sanctuary, you name it, Humane Society of the United States. There's some wonderful organizations with absolutely top-notch lawyers. And when I looked at the pedigree of the attorneys I was competing with after 4 years of practicing a totally different field, I quit. I reevaluated my life and what I wanted to do. once I locked on to the idea of animal law, because I'd always been involved in animal advocacy of some kind, but like Jessica said, you know, I was not, when I was in law school starting in 2000, there wasn't even an animal law class at Tulane, let alone the robust curriculum that's available now in, you know, a lot of schools. So I saw that I was competing for positions with people who had gone to Ivy League schools, who had that federal clerkship experience, who were published on an issue of animal law. And I had to find a way to reverse engineer. And that's what I did. I started doing pro bono work. I started making connections and talking to people and carving out ways to demonstrate my commitment to the issues and my interest in pursuing it as a career option. So I, you know, my interest as a lawyer is that feels like I'm just driven to it. And for me, that's what animal law has been. But I really I always want to make sure that people know a couple of things. And one is, it's never too late to change course. Like, you are not stuck in, if you start doing one thing, like, you don't have to stay with that forever. If you wake up one day, it's not fulfilling anymore. You're not too old. You're not too, you know, you never get to the point where you can't change direction. You know, I've been doing animal protection work for a long time. I also am now doing some work in the motorsports world along with my racing. So, you know, I'm a firm believer that life is not a niche game, and we can do multiple things we love. We can change direction, start over, and mediocre grades are not a dream killer.
Yeah, that's very calming to hear, Ms. Nasser, as we're approaching finals. So I appreciate that. We also got a message from one of our attendees that we have more than non-lawyers here also. So looks like Rasandra Manduka, who's a veterinarian practicing diagnostic and forensic pathology. So we brought a Rose. Thank you for attending. We brought a pretty wide variety of attendees. And thank you both for that advice and for telling us both your story. Next question here. If you could pass one piece of federal legislation or make any state law changes today, what would it be and why? And I'll start with you. We'll stick with you, Ms. Nasser, and then Ms. Rock, we'll move to you.
Well, I'd love to start with what we have, which on the state level, one of the, you know, surprisingly, North Carolina is the only state in the country that has a civil cruelty to animals law. And what that means is that any citizen can file a case court order to have an animal removed from a situation if the judge finds that the animal has been subjected to unlawful cruelty in violation of the criminal statute. So that is extremely effective. And we use that, well, it's been used a number of times now, but in 2012, when I was at the PETA Foundation, we used that statute in order to rescue a bear who had been forced to live in a concrete chain link dog run for his entire life, denied everything that's natural and important to him, fed dry dog food once a day, you know, had been illegally declawed as a cub, and was, as the judge said in that case, denied his veterinary, environmental, and social needs. So he was, so it was not a cruelty case like an animal being beaten or subjected to some of the horrible things that Jessica has described with some of those types of this was psychological abuse and denial of, you know, the ability for this bear to actually engage in a critical species normal behaviors. And so we got a court order to take him out of that facility. He's now at a phenomenal GFAS accredited sanctuary in California's Gold Country. That if we had a statute like that in all 50 states, it would really help us put a dent in these roadside zoos. So that's my wish list for state legislation. On the federal level, aside from the Big Cat Public Safety Act passing, there is another piece of federal legislation called the Animal Welfare Enforcement Improvement Act. And what that would do is establish a citizen suit provision like we have in the Endangered Species Act, but for the Federal Animal Welfare Act. So for a federal agency, I mean, we can't, there's a lot of things we can blame on the current administration, but USDA has always, pardon my, to use a technical term, sucked when it comes to enforcement of the Federal Animal Welfare Act. So, you know, when you look at its own internal auditors going back, you know, over a decade, multiple auditing reports that say that the agency simply refusing to enforce the Animal Welfare Act, the bare threshold minimum standards. Having a citizen suit provision that would enable advocacy organizations with the resources, the expertise, the access to experts in order to bring cases to shut these abusive places down, that's definitely high on my wish list as well.
Wow, great. Thank you. And Ms. Rock, same question for you. And then Evan, I'll let you take over with that third question.
I can certainly echo both of the suggestions that Ms. Nasser just made. I wholeheartedly agree with her on both of them. I think one of the things that I would like to add, especially on the state level, is I really wish, and this is very difficult to do, but I really wish we had some type of mandatory training law for professionals who work with animals, or that we were able to at least provide a good bit of funding every year on the state level for law enforcement officers, animal control officers, veterinarians, prosecutors, judges, everybody who kind of works in the line of animal cruelty, animal fighting investigations and prosecutions, because we even see judges unfortunately just missing the boat a lot of times when it comes to these issues. They don't put certain bond conditions in place. They don't realize that the domestic violence, animal abuse connection, when they're dealing with a certain case, and the way they handle some of these cases is quite frankly horrifying when you know the backstory about what's going on in some of these cases. So I really wish that we had a way to make some type of training mandatory, and funding, you know, is usually the big issue when it comes to training. I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I do a lot of statewide training that's free, but that's because I work under a grant and somebody is kind enough to allow me the ability to go around the state and to train professionals to be able to identify and investigate and prosecute these types of cases. But without proper training, we get nowhere. We can have great laws in place, but if we're not teaching the professionals who are responsible for handling these types of cases to identify these cases and to understand the importance of going forward on them in the legal system, then we can have the best laws in the world, but they have to know what to do and how to you know, identify these types of issues.
Great, thank you. And that actually provides a great segue into kind of the next question that we have. Both of you, I know, do some training, and kind of, can each of you talk about what some of that training is, what it entails, and kind of what the goal of it is, what you're working with, things like that? We can stick with you, Ms. Rock.
Sure. So part of my role is to be the statewide trainer on animal crime. So I go around the state and do day-long trainings, and essentially what I cover is investigations for animal abuse and animal fighting cases, from what I usually call it from the crime scene to the courtroom. So we go all the way through how to identify certain types of evidence, how to investigate these types of crimes, how to collect the evidence, how to process the different evidence in these types of cases. I talk about charging decisions, live evidence handling, motions practice, and trial practice in these cases. The bulk of people that I train, like I mentioned earlier, are law enforcement and animal control officers, Department of Ag investigators, DNR investigators, and then veterinarians are high on my priority list of professionals that, you know, deserve and respect the training on these types of issues to understand what they do when an animal is brought into their clinic, that they suspect abuse from, because there's a lot of myths that surround reporting animal abuse. And so they're one of my primary focuses as well. And then also, obviously, the prosecutors and judges who handle these cases in the courtroom.
Thank you. And same to you, Ms. Nasser, if you could talk about some of the training that you've done.
Well, one of the things that we were doing at MSU was creating a manual for law enforcement officers to know what to do in dangerous animal encounters. You know, and like one of the we have so much law enforcement support for the Big Cat Public Safety Act, because, you know, I know, like, for me, like my brother's a firefighter, and like it's a job that's dangerous enough as it is, without walking into a house on fire and having to deal with a leopard, you know, like somebody's pet leopard. And these are situations that happen. So so our first responders like really deserve that legislation to pass. However, in the meantime, while we deal with the problem, what we'd like to do is provide more training for them to know who to call. You know, we had a situation in Louisiana where law enforcement was executing a search warrant and the house, and they saw a tiger cub chained to a out in the backyard, and they had no idea what to do about it, even though Louisiana actually has a very clear state law prohibiting private ownership of tigers. They didn't know, and so they started, when they left the property, they called Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries, and the Fisheries Department say, turn around, go back, get that tiger. And as the police were driving back to the house, the people in the house were loading the tiger into the back of a truck. And if they hadn't gotten there then, that cat would have disappeared into the black hole that I mentioned earlier. The good news, he's now at an, but a lot of cats are going to end up dying on the end of that chain. And in the meantime, you know, our law enforcement officers, like, you know, they shouldn't with in homes. And our first, well, if somebody's got a medical emergency, but then the paramedics have to deal with a venomous snake or a lion or a chimpanzee, something of this nature, like, it's absolutely ludicrous and unfair to our first responders. So, you know, what we're seeking to do is provide a manual and training on who to call, just very simply what the relevant law is, who the true sanctuaries are, who will take the call, hop in the car, come get that animal, and keep them either permanently or just pending, you know, a resolution of whatever kind of case is going to happen. So, you know, we're trying to empower our first responders with the knowledge of what to do in those situations, who they can call and who they can call for help.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for both of the work that you guys are doing in that area. Ms. Rock, this one is probably going to be directed a little bit more towards you, but Ms. Nasser, feel free to, when Ms. Rock is done, if you have any insight on this as well, kind of jump in. But you spoke about kind of the link that you've seen between, you know, an animal abuse case, and then you end up discovering a lot of gambling and other crimes that end up kind of developing from there. Can you kind of give us some insight into kind of how that development happens? Is it, you know, they arrive on scene and discover those things, or they're there for a different reason, kind of how that development happens?
Well, when we talk about animal fighting cases specifically, a lot of times we discover animal fighting cases because of undercover drug investigations. The FBI, DEA spend a good bit of time up on federal wires listening to individuals talk about the drug trade because they're investigating them for drug trafficking. And what they find is then they start hearing terms and phrases and things like that they don't know what it is because they don't have training on it. But once we do kind of are able to get in there and teach these folks what it is they're hearing on these wires, we uncover a lot more than just a little drug ring, because a lot of times individuals who are involved in animal fighting, you know, as a profession, so to speak, because that's what they do. They think it's their career. They are oftentimes, selling drugs to support their dog fighting or cockfighting habit, or vice versa. So we see a huge connection between drugs and those types of animal fighting cases. When it comes to animal cruelty cases, that just kind of runs the gamut. Sometimes, obviously, we're talking about animal cruelty when it's related to animal fighting cases, but a lot of times we see just your run-of-the-mill, any day animal cruelty cases just all over the country, in your backyards, in your neighborhoods, things like that. We uncover, again, a lot of these types of cases through other investigations, from domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse. And what's important to know is that all of these types of cases oftentimes do require a coordinated community response. It is up to us as a community to report these types of crimes when we suspect them. It's up to our law enforcement agencies and our social service workers to cross-report these suspicions of these different types of cases to each other, and for everybody to kind of understand the significance of tying the animal and the animal crimes to these other types of cases. Our victim advocates, our pet-friendly safe houses, our child abuse advocates, DFACs, I talked about this a lot earlier, our elder abuse advocates, case service workers, like Adult Protective Services, law enforcement, animal control, Department of Ag, Department of Natural Resources, on the federal level, USDA. Everybody's got to be talking and communicating and coordinating to make sure that we properly investigate these types of cases, because we have one shot. We have one shot to gather the evidence that we need. We have one shot when we go in on a search warrant. And if you don't know what you're looking for, oftentimes things are missed. So that's why training on these issues is so important as well.
Do you have anything you would like to add to that, Ms. Nasser, in terms of some experience you've had with seeing development of various crimes?
You rarely see wildlife trafficking without other types of crimes, and the type of person that, uses hammers and pliers to partially amputate like a young tiger is not typically the type of person who's particularly kind to anybody else. And I'm not a mental health professional, so I don't want to, I don't want to like improperly diagnose, but there is what appears to tick the boxes on like a lot of like really, really serious like narcissistic behavior, and a lot of the types of activity that frequently come with that. So, I've seen people who are engaged in abusive tigers, whether it's using really, really abusive training techniques. I mean, there's a guy out in Nevada who lost his USDA license because he was using withholding of water as a training technique for young cubs. But he was also reportedly going to the animal shelter and getting dogs to feed to his tigers. So while working at the animal shelter. So, and he has a criminal history of stalking, assault, things of this nature. So this is, I can't like say every single situation is exactly the same, but you rarely see the type of disregard for life of any kind without just willingness to act completely self-interested in a lot of other venues as well. So because wildlife trafficking is one of the most lucrative black market industries globally, we're talking about something that's only eclipsed by human trafficking, narcotics, and weapons. We see people who, like one of the men who was featured in Tiger King, who have been drug kingpins in the past. And, when you do a side-by-side comparison of the dollar value of trafficking a certain type of drugs versus the same dollar value trafficking in wildlife, if you get caught, you're going to get a comparative slap on the wrist. If you're engaged in wildlife trafficking, there's simply not the resources. They're really categorized as environmental crimes, and we just don't have the same view of prosecuting those types of cases that we do narcotics or, you know, weapons trafficking or human trafficking. So, and obviously all of that's important to do and pursue, but there has been, you know, a shift towards, and this is why it's important, because when we crack down on wildlife trafficking, we're also cracking down on people who are engaged in a lot of other really bad stuff.
Absolutely. Ms. Rock, you spoke earlier about kind of how you're open to meeting with anybody who wants to get involved in this and kind of see how they can make this their career. Kind of what advice do you have for an individual who wanted to get some experience, whether it's an internship or something of that nature, with the criminal and animal law side of things?
Any internship that you can get while in law school is fabulous. I think Carney Anne mentioned some of the great organizations who have internships and are all over the country. ALDF, obviously, you all know, is a great organization. HSUS and a lot of large, you know, animal welfare organizations out there. You can always, you know, once you get into practice, just volunteer your time to help on big cases like Carney Anne works on. I know she mentioned FOIA requests. That takes a lot of time and a lot of sifting through documents on some of these types of cases. So you can always just assist with, you know, doing FOIA requests in certain types of cases. On the criminal side of things, you know, attend conferences, volunteer to help on cases. I've had a legal intern pretty much every semester of my career, because I do believe that as attorneys, it is up to us to give back to our profession and to help mentor younger attorneys. So I am always open to taking on interns. Another thing that you can do too is work on legislation. Legislation, as Carney Anne will tell you, you know, we've got some good laws in this country on the federal level, on the state level, but there's always room for improvement. There's always room for improvement, and getting legislation passed takes a lot of grunt work. It takes a lot of legwork. A lot of times in states like where I live in Georgia, you know, you mention the word animal down at the Capitol and everybody wants to run in a different direction because they don't want us to, a lot of times, you know, people don't want to be told what they can and can't do with their animals. But it's not about that. And it's about convincing people that are tasked to passing these laws that all we're trying to do is prevent harm and suffering, not only from animals, but to human beings as well. So there's a number of ways that you can get involved, whether it's on the volunteer side of things or you ultimately make a career out of it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ms. Nasser, is there anything you want to add in some of the internships that you're kind of familiar with and opportunities out there?
Well, I take a little different approach and talk about are within your control that you can do regardless of whether you've gotten an internship or not, because there are like a limited number. But you know, so much of the animal law world is about relationships and building relationships. And so it's really important that people are proactive with building those relationships. And what my recommendation would be is when you can reach out to people and ask to talk to them, whether it's an informational interview. I mean, we're living in this amazing world of Zoom now where that's totally normalized. And so asking for 10 minutes of somebody's time over Zoom, you know, that's an easy thing. You know, they don't have to go anywhere. Like it's a very easy thing to say yes to. But what I always recommend that students do is don't ask for advice. Ask for someone to tell you their story. You will get more value and you will, without coming across like you're asking for a free favor. So that's my one piece of advice, just insert languaging the request. But I dedicate for my students, like I'm a huge fan of social media and personal branding. We're all building a personal brand all the time and everything that we do. And so I dedicate a full day of my class for my law students to specific targeted LinkedIn training and strategy. Because just because you're not in the field yet doesn't mean that you can't start sharing content and creating conversations around legal developments in animal law. And so that's helpful to demonstrating that you're super interested in the field, that you're having interesting conversations about it, that you're engaging with others. engage with other animal lawyers. Don't be bashful about reaching out to them. Like Jessica, like I've never said no to having a conversation with anybody. I mean, I had a conversation just with somebody who wasn't pursuing animal law, but we just happened to go to the same, I don't know if they were GW or it was, saw that I had lived in Dallas for 4 years, and they were like, I'm moving to Dallas to pursue real estate law or something. Like, I'm sure I'll talk to you. Like, you know, it's, I think particularly right now, we all are interested in connecting and building community. Like, even those of us who are like the experts in the field, like we're all going through the weirdness of COVID and everything that comes with it. And I think that I enjoy those conversations. It's inspiring for me to have the opportunity to like be like, here's what doesn't work, here's what does work, you know, like let's like sharing those experiences. So yeah, just ask for people to share their story. Be super active on LinkedIn. I think it's really important. Those are some things that you can do within your control, regardless of what the internship, fellowship, and job situation looks like.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for both of you for that insight. Ryan, I think that's all the questions that I was assigned, so I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Evan. And Ms. Rock, Ms. Nasser, I know we've passed the time, or we're bumping up against it here. I don't want to be discourteous to either of your time. Do you guys have another maybe 5 minutes or so?
Certainly.
Okay, great. So yeah, we had, some audience questions come in and everything, but there was one more thing that I wanted to ask, just for both of you personally. You've both been involved with some big cases here and there, certainly with some media attention, and involving things that involve high crimes with like organized criminal groups. I'm sure there's probably something of that probably invokes a little bit of fear or concern for your life. And then there's also media attention. So can you just explain, when a case starts to balloon up, maybe media attention comes in, maybe it's involving someone, some organized crime ring or something, how does your career and your personal life change? And I'll start with you, Ms. Rock.
Well, I have throughout my entire career had a lot of media attention on a lot of my cases, and that's because people care about animals and people don't like to hear about individuals harming animals, whether it's on, a state level, it's on a federal level, it's on a smaller scale level, or it's on a larger scale level. And I just don't honestly let it affect me. I kind of have tunnel vision when it comes to my job and my duties and what it is that I'm required to do. I don't talk to the media about my cases until they're over with. I will answer questions about whatever is maybe already out there in the public, which is pretty much the only thing that I can do as a prosecutor, is anything that's public information already. But outside of that, I want my cases to play out in a courtroom where they're supposed to, under our law. And I, firmly believe in our judicial system, and, and I respect it. And, I appreciate the media's attention and time and interest into these cases, because honestly, I think that's how we get the public to understand how significant and serious these cases are. I can just even mention about Ms. Nasser's, case involving Joe Exotic. So many people got wrapped up in this TV show. And it wasn't until really, I think a lot of people, started understanding that with this massive media attention that this person got, and all the people that surrounded him, how horrifying these things were that were going on behind the scenes. And I think now a conversation started to develop about that a lot more. But I can just even say, when the TV show was going on, I got asked all the time, are you going to watch the show? Are you going to watch the show? And I was like, very hard no. I have nothing for it. I have, I don't want to see any of that stuff. I know what he's doing, and it's disgusting, and it's horrifying that the media is glorifying him. So, I've been very lucky in my cases. I've never had the media glorify any of my cases. My cases have gotten media attention to the point of, this is horrible. We want to know, let you know it's out there. And most of the time it's the dogfighting cases that are getting a lot of media attention. But, it can be good and bad in a lot of ways. But like I said, my focus is just always, resolving my cases in the courtroom. And the media, I think is can be good, can be bad, but I stay focused on what my job is in the courtroom.
Thank you. And yeah, Ms. Nasser, and we've seen you on some national news outlets and things like that as well. And obviously, you've been involved with some pretty big cases. Same question for you.
I actually really enjoy the media work. I do a lot of media, whether it's television, print, radio, documentary, whatnot. Like I do so much media work over the past decade in the United States and internationally too. And it's one of my most favorite parts of my job because I love being able to have conversations that are going to resonate with the people who are going to be making decisions about what kinds of entertainment to do with their family. I love having conversations about that really explain in terms that are not legal and obtuse that what's going on behind the scenes with cub petting and wildlife trafficking and all of these issues. So I love media work. It's one of my most favorite things that I do in my job, and I think it's really important. It's important for any social justice advocacy, regardless of the issue. Having a really robust media program is super important. I think when I was at PETA, we did 45 press releases a day. So it's really that piece, the public awareness and education, is very, very important. Now on the side of, things that I've encountered, I've never been fearful of in any particular situation. That being said, I have been warned by some local legislators not to return and only to appear by telephone for certain hearings, and it actually had to relate to the guy I was telling you about who used to, allegedly feed dogs to tigers and who had the very long, violent criminal record. But I had been using zoning law to go after his permit to keep tigers, and so being there in like a rural Nevada town, the county said to me, like, I think it's probably safer for you just to call in this time. So that's really been the only time that anything like that has been, we all get threats. Like, it's just like, Joe's threatened the life of like a lot of people. One of his favorite things to do is either threaten others or accuse animal protection attorneys of doing horrible things to deflect, attention off of himself. I have been sued personally for defamation in Texas. In the beginning of a citizen suit under the Endangered Species Act, the first thing you have to do is send a 60-day notice letter to the owner in order to let them know like what you believe the violations are, and also copy the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and give them the opportunity to institute their own enforcement action. And in response, rather than responding to my 60-day notice letter, the Houston Rockets owner of the Landry's restaurant conglomerate sued me for defamation. And long story short, I won at trial, I won on appeal, and I won in the Texas Supreme Court. So that ended well. It was a little nerve-wracking because in Texas, you don't necessarily know which way things might fall, sympathetic wise, but there's this really robust anti-SLAPP, there's a SLAPP statute in Texas that I was able to utilize in my motions to dismiss. And they also sued Animal Legal Defense Fund for defamation. I'd been working with them, and they sued a local activist. And so that's, that is, I had joked for many years about the circus world, like, because we frequently get letters, like cease and desist letters, like, we're gonna sue you for defamation. And I'm like, oh, I wish somebody finally would, so that we could actually take depositions and get into discovery, and I could depose all their employees, and this would be great. And like, I had been joking that nobody would ever do it, and that finally it happened. So anyway, but this is mission driven, purpose driven, passion driven work. So none of these things are deterrents. It's just kind of part of the territory. So.
Wow. Yeah, really well said. Do either of you, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you both for sticking with us for, significantly past this when we were scheduled to go. We really appreciate it. And we have recorded this, so we'll send it to you, Ms. Nasser and Ms. Rock.
Okay.
And we'll put it out there too for students who weren't able to attend. But before we leave off, do either of you want to give any kind of closing statements or say anything else? We'll start with you,
I
Ms.
don't have
Nasser.
anything to say except for go vote.
Go vote. Go vote. If you haven't done it, you still got
Alright.
about 6 or 7 hours. Go do it. Ms. Rock?
I just want to say thanks to everyone again for your interest in animal crime related issues. As you can see from both the work that Ms. Nasser and I do, there's just so much more involved in these types of cases than anybody could ever imagine. And if we stop people from abusing animals, it certainly spirals into stopping abuse on so many other different levels. So thank you all very much for your interest, and I'm always here to help or answer questions or do anything I can for you.
Likewise.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you both. Hopefully this is not the last time we get both of you to speak to us. So I know in my next 3 years, I'll probably be reaching out again for sure. So I really appreciate it. Well, thank you both.
Thank you both.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you guys. Thank you for everybody for coming as well.
Okay. Have a great
Bye.
day.